Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, but most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And of course, most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards that top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players, with over 40 episodes now to date. Wow. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I know I say this, it has to be nearly every episode. Thank you so much if you've been listening to us for some time now. You know what we're all about, and oh my goodness, how far we have come. And if you're new, thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy yourselves, but also I would encourage you to have a look at some of our previous episodes just to get a feel of where we've come from and where we're going. Today's episode it's so important, and I think the 40 plus episodes previously have been building to today's topic, and I think it's something that is incredibly rare to be discussed, but it's so important to be discussed throughout that athlete, irrespective of what level that athlete is at, but throughout that performance spectrum. And it really is absolutely critical. So, you've guessed it, obviously, and it's how to plan for the future, guiding players to success. And if you want to follow along today, we are on page 217. But I think before we dive in, it's so important to share, I think, additional insights that obviously are not on the paper, so to speak. And planning for the future is akin to every single individual out there with a plan. And every episode, again, we do like taking that humanized approach. And this has to be obviously one of the topics. It's a standout. It's like you're gonna put it in neon lines or put it on a sign, because planning for the future is it's fundamental, so you know where you're going. And irrespective what sport you play, or if you do or don't play a sport, you have some type of idea where you're going or where you want to go. And then if you're really serious about that, you got a plan. So you're going to backtrack. But it's not like those skills from 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age. You need to progressively learn them, and to learn them you obviously rely on your parents and or guardians, but most importantly in the sporting spectrum, it's your coach. And unfortunately, again, is because not enough coaches understand that pathway. And I will share a personal recount in this respect, because I remember when I was peaking or coming out of that developmental age range and starting to build on those peak performances, which we've touched on in previous episodes. I was absolutely lost. I did not know where to go. And my coach at the time, they were very unhelpful. I remember even at 14 years of age, writing a letter to someone. I'm pretty sure it was a university overseas, and recall I am based in Australia, and thinking, this program, this tennis program sounds amazing. Is this my next step? Is this where I'm meant to be, like now, to get to that next level? And I faintly recall seeing this, advertisement / article in probably one of the magazines, and tennis magazines that I was reading, and think, okay, I will get in touch with them. And I wrote them at 14 years of age, this big letter about my background, my achievements and everything, only for them to email me back, thank you to them for doing that I needed to be older, that I had to graduate to begin with. So I was obviously too young. But in hindsight, I'm so proud of myself that I took that step. But also it just goes to show that how much guidance was not available. My parents at the time, they were not involved in my tennis development. My coach though, and this is the majority of cases, was responsible and for paving the way and guiding. And I cannot tell you how many athletes I've spoken with and their parents who I am actually not their coach. I've come in and as an advisor to oversee, to be of help. And they do not know their pathway and where we're going. We've touched on in a lot of episodes the pathway and the long game. So that's available at AMA International. But specifically, it's once you've done your first 10 years of play, so you've reached a reasonable level, you have a good control of the ball, and most of the time it goes where you want it to go. You have relatively good technical parameters that you have developed, and you're looking to, as I call it, push the marker just further and further. So it's that getting that peak performance and then that next, and it's a gradual progression. Now these gradual progressions, they lead to those peaks and that next level of play as you enter that next 10 years, so that you're into that 20 years of play, which we've touched on previously as well. But specifically, you need to know how to get there. Every child, athlete, player, that they need like a map to know what they're doing. Now, there are obviously some players out there that they know because they've got coaches that have either been there or they understand or have taken the time to explain to them. Unfortunately, I've come across a lot of coaches. I won't say all. I will say that the significant majority of coaches that do not know. Now, this is for varying reasons. It could be because they never reach that level, which that's okay. Most of the best coaches in the world don't use that, contrary to varying beliefs out there. There is actually no relationship in respect to developing an athlete and being a previous player. There are some previous players that do make very good coaches, but that is in the scarce minority, and I can't emphasize that enough. That's another topic, and we have touched on that in other episodes, but that is not the pitfall in this scenario, because these coaches who have not reached that level, it's to do with them becoming familiar with what's next, what steps are next for their player. So even if they have not experienced it themselves, that's no excuse. It's about looking up and doing that due diligence so you understand the road ahead and what it takes. These roads ahead, however, can take varying forms. Some may want to take the standardized approach, which is you're going to peak through the juniors, you're going to play up a level, up an age range, and then you're going to progress, then you're going to enter the bigger tournaments, and eventually you will play that initial ITF and or challenger tournament to look at getting those initial ranking points, and then you progressively progress and ascend your ranking, whether it's from that 1200 down to 900, 500, and it's a steady progression over the next couple of years before you get really serious when you're say 300 and you ascend a little bit more rapidly, so to speak. However, oftentimes this gets lost in the junior ranks. And when I say lost in the junior ranks, too much emphasis is placed on those junior tournaments and playing them almost every weekend, if not every other weekend, and having that full training load and that full tournament load, and you're going and you're going and you're going. And sometimes you're winning, sometimes your results aren't what you want it to be, but you keep doing it. And it's this continuous vicious cycle almost, because you don't get to come up for air. Your ranking, it's good, so it's steady and or it's progressing, but at the same time you're overloading yourself. And some juniors at this stage will enter, if they've been performing very well, they will enter junior grand slams, which of course is an exceptional result in and of itself. That is remarkable for a junior athlete to reach those heights. However, some of the best players in the world never won a Grand Slam, a junior Grand Slam. And some of the best players in the world, again, didn't even play them. Didn't even make that mark. And so it's so important to be conscious of those varying approaches, that you don't necessarily need to play a junior Grand Slam, but that might be your preference before, as they call it, turning pro, so becoming a professional. And or you will not play those junior Grand Slams. You will take your time and work on your skills and steadily progress and opt to play other events. There are varying pathways. So one that I actually took and has become more common of late, and I only say more common or popular of late, is because we're seeing some players from the system. And what I'm referring to is the NCAA, so the National Collegiate Athletics Association, which is based in the States. So unlike Australia, for example, the United States has a very robust and healthy sporting system within their tertiary framework. Not all, but a lot of universities offer that. Obviously, you have to be of age to attend university, but it's a remarkable system. And I say that, I mean, there are definitely weak points, so that's not, but I just want to focus on here is the caliber of play and the training load that you potentially have access to. When I talk about the access to, though, this is referring to the typical athlete within that age range that doesn't necessarily have sponsors funding all of their training and travel. as also was the case for me. Even though at that time I did have one primary sponsor, it wasn't enough to upkeep the demands of whether it's the training load to the travel and all of the expenses that come with becoming and pursuing that pathway to become a professional athlete, and obviously in this case tennis. So the NCAA also allows you, if you're fortunate enough to gain a scholarship, that was me, to partake in high levels of play. Now, depending if you're in Division 1, Division 2 or Division 3, it's really going to vary on that level. I personally was in Division 2. Oftentimes there's a very big confusion between Division 1 and 2 and that caliber, but there are still very high calibers or level of play in Division 2, but it really depends on your entry point and your level of play at that point in time. So you do get a lot of athletes and those high level D2s and D1 schools with the capacity to potentially turn professional after. There are some rulers, let's say, that you need to be mindful of during that time to become professional, but also to gain entry into the NCAA at my time. These rules may have changed, so please don't put me on the record for this, but you had to be very conscious if you were to gain entry, to be approved, to make sure you did not collect prize money. So you had to turn it down. You could still win the tournaments, but you could not collect, which means if there's a different pathway, if you're playing junior grand slams and collecting prize money, for example, the NCAA is not that pathway for you, but you obviously potentially have the funding if you're at the junior grand slams to continue along that pathway. Though it's so important to highlight here, and again I've touched on in previous episodes, the amount of juniors you see at the junior grand slams that are already carrying an injury because they're overdone, so they're overloaded and their schedule is incredibly rigorous, and you need to come up air because at the end of the day you want to sustain for the next 10 years of play. And again, in previous episodes we've touched on the rate of injury that hinders that rate of progress because they're so prevalent. And you really need to look at safeguarding that player, that athlete, the child to begin with, because we're talking about athletes and they could be 14, 15, 16 years of age at this level. So it's so, I think it's a number one priority is safeguarding athletes is, underscore in neon lights there. Once you obviously reach that 17 plus years of age is when you're typically starting to have your first big significant peak. If you are already holding those ranking points and you are progressively ascending towards, whether it's, that 700, 400, 200, etc. Because if you maintain that rate of progress, and again, contrary to varying misconceptions, you maintain that by the time you're in your early to mid 20s, so 23, 24, which is again that 5-6 year age gap there, you're going to reach top 30, potentially 20 in the world if you maintain your performance peaks, which means there's a cycle there. And so one of the previous episodes was around periodization and looking at performance peaks. So you're continuously putting in the work. What unfortunately goes wrong for a lot of athletes, that even though they have kind of a pathway because they're already there, they don't actually have that succinct plan for the future. So in the future, they want to be a top 20 player, maybe or hopefully a top 10 player. But it's understanding what it takes to get there. And this is why we see so many players hover outside the top 100. Because like, what specifically are you working on and doing to reach that next performance peak? Now, all of this obviously ties into and back into the 7 keys and their respective integration within the player's game. Now, the good news is for the players who do not have access to huge amounts of funding, let's say, that would allow them to have their own specific coach, is around the 7 keys are not exclusively dependent on another. And when we say not exclusively dependent on the other, on one side, it absolutely is. So, and on that side is that you really do need that coach that contributes to not merely your game, but that coach-athlete relationship and the inner workings of the 7 keys that brings it even more so to life. But the other side, which is I am sharing, which I typically would not, but we've gotten this far. So if you are listening and you are considering this, I would encourage you to listen to all of our previous episodes so you understand how you can get to this point. Now, I'm sharing this from the perspective that funding is limited and you want to keep progressing until so you have enough funding to be able to have that coach a part of your team. So where this comes in is that the technical properties and the proponents of the 7 keys you can progressively integrate and work on to get you to that ranking range that will allow you to fund or have that funding for that full-time coach. Because once you're able to have that full-time coach and they're also on board with the 7 keys and understand the 7 keys, that's when the real magic can happen. However, if they are not on board with the 7 keys and they have not upskilled to learn the 7 keys and they are not conscious of integrating the 7 keys into your game, then save your money. That's a no. And I say that from the best possible way for the coaches out there. Please upskill to ascertain the 7 keys, to know how to integrate them progressively into that athlete's game. One of the most exciting things and or concepts is the text I've touched on previously, is the I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru, which is essentially, the title says it all, because compiled in that book essentially is a tennis coach. So your guru, if you like, but there are lessons in there and planners for your first 10 years of play that allow you to set yourself up for the next 10 years of play. So I use this argument all the time, like, what price tag do you put on having access to lessons and planners even in the space of 12 months? That's there for 10 years for you, which is almost unheard of. It's an incredible body of work that it did take a lot of time to put together, but also most excitingly, they're from first-hand accounts and knowledge of that I've been able to practice over the years. So these are exclusive lessons and planners that I have integrated at some point in time over the last 18 years. So what you can do with this is progressively integrate this into your game if funding is that issue as well. Because irrespective funding or no funding, the two of them are synonymous. They go hand in hand. So whether that's I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru and that full-time coach, or I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru and the 7 keys, they're interconnected. And all of the I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru is reliant on all of the preceding text. So it teaches you how to progressively integrate from, the current book and the one we're talking about, so The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, but all the way through to the 7 keys and the text from, the Science of Elite Performance through to the What Is Your Game Missing series. And there are key facets within each text that are absolutely fundamental on that pathway towards that top 10 tennis ranking. But if we bring it all back to, the pathway you're after, to, how to plan for the future, it's so important to have that guide to be able to guide you towards where you want to go, whether it is that top 10 tennis ranking, or maybe you aspire to become a professional tennis player and reach the top 100. Irrespective of what it is, they're obviously streamlined and parallel with, because you can get to 100 and maintain that plateau if you desire, or you can continue that ascension towards the top 10, but it's the key metrics that count. The 7 keys are still applicable. There's a reason why, players ranked 150 to 100 in the world, they stay within that ranking range, or they ascend, 90, 80 in the world, and then they regress to around that 110, 100 in the world. And we know why. And it's because they have not ascertained consistently. So underscore consistently the 7 keys. We know how they are attributed to progressions, but also how they are attributed to regressions in performance and in play, which obviously is correlated with your results. Now, to reach that next level, so if you're a top 20 player listening, we know the key metrics that are involved in pushing the marker to getting you from 20 in the world to 15 in the world to becoming a barrier breaker. And the 7 keys, if you have not integrated them already, as soon as you start integrating them, you will see it in your performance and in your ranking, which is incredibly exciting. Now, for the players who are academy club level, who are yet to secure their maiden ranking points, integrating these from a younger age within that developmental spectrum will allow you to ascend more rapidly, but not too rapidly, because we want to make sure the work's being put in, but your body also has that time to adapt. Because if you overload your body at a young age without it being strong enough to withstand the load, you're setting yourself up for those injuries later on. Which means if you are 14, 15 years of age and a heavy load, you really need to ask yourself, have you built out? Are you equipped to maintain and sustain this load? Most likely the answer is no, because if you are in that age range, you are not out of adolescence and or that developmental spectrum. You are still developing, which means you really need to wait until you're that 17, 18 to put in more work. Now, you see a lot of new players who are peaking on tour who are quite young. And when I say quite young, I'm talking about that, 17, 18, 19 specifically. One of the best examples, I have to say, and I did share this in one of our previous episodes, is the most recent US Open and Coco Gauff winning her maiden championship. So despite everything else that I've shared, she was 19, but she came on tour at 15. I think like around that, it's not in front of me. But we marked that she needed to progress, but not too quickly for that to happen and to maintain that performance. If, for example, she had won a slam sooner, there was an increased likelihood that she would then regress and or succumb to an injury. However, the best part is our data was right. And I love it when that happens, because it's not the first time. And again, for more, listen to our last two, specifically our episodes. But what I'm sharing here is that whilst 19 is young, she did peak at 15-ish. And then she didn't ascend too rapidly. So Gore progressed to maintain those peak performances when it counts, which means she did make the finals of a championship, and then another, and that another was the one she won. And these are the progressions we're looking at, is that when you have that big peak, it does not need to be the best or your biggest peak, because we want to not plateau, but we want to steadily progress. If you go from plateauing to an increased progression, that is your absolute peak performance, and you wonder why you drop off so quickly, more often than not, it's because you went too quickly, opposed to a level you can maintain and sustain over the long game. Now, we build up on that, so it's a condition, you're conditioned in a sense for that level. So when we want to talk about planning and planning for the future, irrespective of how old you are and what your ranking is, I mean, it is a little bit different. If you are top 20, you are equipped to ascend quicker. But for a top 20 player to ascend into the top 10, I'm still going to give you 12 months or 1 to 2 years, because it is still progressive. Contrary to, other beliefs, how it could just happen overnight. It could if your performance is parallel with that at this moment in time. But if there's still work to be done, specific keys to integrate, that's okay, because the best part is if you progress steadily, you're more likely to maintain your hold inside the top 10, opposed to regressing. So the same applies for that academy club player, the same applies for that top 500. And if they ascend really quickly to top 100 and they're not sure what they did or how they did it or how they got there, and then they regress and they go back into old habits, of course their ranking is going to regress with them within that older ranking range. All right, this is a lot. So before we get carried away a bit more, let's just share a few sections from this chapter. So again, if you want to follow along, we are on page 217. More often than not, I get clueless looks from both players and parents alike when I ask them how they are going to get to where they want to be in their sport, how they plan on achieving their sporting objectives. Specifically, this question is asked of high-performance players or athletes who have the ambition to work towards becoming a professional, playing overseas, or landing a scholarship in the NCAA system. To date, I do not think I have come across one parent or player that has been guided on how to get there, how to achieve their sporting goals. This is a big downfall in sports coaching and coach education overall. And that really surmises, I think, what we touched on at the very beginning before we started, narrowing in on that performance-specific pathway. But it's really sad. And I guess I'm here to help mend that, because you need to get to a certain level at that club and or academy where you are experiencing the wins, where you are developing those technical patterns of play that allow you to win. So you're challenging not just your physical abilities, but also your mental and emotional on-court abilities. So we want to get to a good level here. And then we're going to progress. We're going to find those next tournaments and those bigger wins that we can go after. And then we're going to look at what tournaments we can get access to that hold ranking points. To get there, we want to make sure our level is pushing the marker, that we know we can get there. And oftentimes it does take playing varying age ranges, for example, for age group based events or open events, before we can get there, because by participating in those type of events, you are also challenging yourself, if done right, to reach that next peak performance, because that's what we're about. We want to challenge ourselves, push ourselves to reach that next peak performance marker. Now, it's quite easy to do that, to enter those bigger events and to ascend, because it's the same patterns, right? And you want to eventually get the win, and then more wins and more and so on. But there will come a time where you'll plateau. So that is why there are a lot of players, unfortunately, that stay playing those challenger ITF level events, because they cannot get direct entry into the WTA and or ATP tour events, or the results are not there. On one side, it's actually very smart, because they're able to earn a living, so to speak, from that prize money, compared to being knocked back or losing, for example, in a qualifying round and being out of pocket. So that's why it's so important to level up that funding, to know where can I go with this, what is the most cost-effective solution, but also to make sure you're guided and there is a budget in place to allow you to get there. And I know at this age or in this demographic, using the word budget almost seems quite foreign, but it's also knowing that winning your first senior tournament that could have a $10,000 prize purse doesn't happen overnight. But to get to that point is probably going to cost you a lot more than that $10,000 prize. And so that is why it's so important to have that triangular relationship where we talk about, the coach and the player, but also the parent and the coach, to understand that pathway. So you also are conscious of that budget in place. So how much, and are you positioned for that? If not, then what other pathway can you take that is more cost effective? And trust me, those options are available. Quite typically for the Australian players, without support, they're going to play the events just in Australia, and that has grown over the years. There really wasn't that many 10-20 years ago, so it was incredibly hard to get any points unless you were overseas. And for someone who did not have access to that funding, they essentially missed out, which is heartbreaking. It was a lot easier, and it still maintains or remains very more readily available for players based in the US and or Europe, because there are more tournaments at that level in those areas. Of course, the same applies for players based in different parts of the world, that they are almost left behind because it's not as saturated. So I'm a very firm believer that more funding sources need to be made available for players to get to that level to begin with, and to help fund that, because oftentimes there's a barrier between a player who progresses and not, and it's not their performance, it's actually funding based. That's another big topic. But that is also, or underscores, why AMA International was developed with accessibility and affordability front and center. Because I was one of those players that did not have access and was vulnerable to that affordability scale. So that the finances, if you do not have all those sponsors, was not feasible. And that's why for me it was a no-brainer to go and play in the NCAA on a full scholarship, because the funding sources were almost ran dry in Australia. And I know that is the case for a lot of Australians who do go over, but also athletes from other countries as well. And that is a very big hole in the system that we hope to address, and we have progressively been. But that's where, I'm so proud of AMA International to make it available to you, because you can still follow the pathway to the long game at a fraction of the price. And I like to put myself in the shoes of whether it's a player or a coach or a parent, because I've been there, to say we want to make it accessible to you and affordable to allow you to reach your peak performance. So funding is not that barrier. There are always options and alternative approaches to allow you to get there. And that's really what it's all about. Now, look, I know we've only shared a brief snippet from today's chapter, because there's just so much more to it that's, again, not on the paper, because who would have thought we got all the way to funding, to budgets, when we're looking at that pathway, accessibility, affordability, reaching those peak performance cycles, but also knowing really what it takes and the options, whether it is the junior grand slams, whether it is the NCAA or something else. The options are there, but also understanding the progressions, how it takes time. So our recent Grand Slam champion progression, how it took her those 4 years from breaking on tour and peaking with, I think it was around a 16 result at a Grand Slam before actually winning one. But these metrics actually worked in an athlete's favor. Being in the top 10 now, winning her maiden championship is absolutely exceptional, but it's the perfect example of what our data talks about and works towards, and the 7 keys affords. So if you're serious about progressing towards the top 100 to top 50 and eventually the top 10, we know it's absolutely possible. With those 7 keys, AMA International has made it accessible and affordable to allow players all around the world, irrespective of where you're based, to progress towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. To grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AMA International. That's am8international.com. For any comments or questions, head on over to AM8 or Topic Thread. That's the social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn or Instagram. And please do come and say hi. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. So I'd like to think we've got all platforms covered, and I do personally check them all. So come and say hi. It would be absolutely wonderful. To catch up on, again, those weekly coaching tips, they're also in our blogs, just reframed and shaped. So for those of you who would prefer to knuckle down and read, I mean, I'm a little bit biased there. And if you know why, then hat tip off. So head on over to Medium, and as always, it's accessible on AM8 under our blogs tabs, and I will leave all of the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. And to view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on one of our other platforms. And for something a little left of field, visit Sprout for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AIM International, as well as options to personally and exclusively work with myself. So come say hi and don't be shy. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.